So the last few weeks, or the first 4 weeks, we talked about different plant nutrition topics, all the way from basic soils to micronutrients and macronutrients, everywhere in between. So today we're kind of moving on to crop protection topics. And we'll touch on some different crop protection topics over the next 4 weeks, I think. Today will be a basic overview. Next week we'll talk about some of the specific modes of action. And then the following week we'll continue that discussion on some different commonly used modes of action for herbicides. And then after that we'll move on to fungicides, insecticides, and seed treatments. But as far as today, like I said, it's going to be a fairly basic discussion to get us started on the herbicide topic. And so we'll take the first 15, 20 minutes to touch on a key resource to help out. That's the crop protection guide. And then after this, then we'll kind of move on and talk about some very basic properties related to pesticides and herbicides that affect their performance. And that'll kind of give us a foundation to then move on to the discussion around mode of action next week. So, but to start off with, crop protection guide. And I guess I'll maybe share my video so it's not just somebody from cyberspace talking. So the crop protection guide. So hopefully you have a copy of the crop protection guide, whether it be a digital copy or a print copy. I've actually got a print copy in my office. I've got a print copy in the truck, and then I've got a digital copy on the computer and a digital copy on my phone. So a very useful resource. A lot of people refer to it as the Winfield Bible. You can see up here at the top, 983 pages of intense information. So it's a very good resource to have on hand. You know, we all get different kinds of questions that we have to try to answer related to pesticides and rates and placement and timings and even some of the technical properties related to different pesticides. And a lot of that information is contained in the crop protection guide. I will mention that it is not a replacement for the label for a given pesticide. The label is the law, but this is a very useful resource to have on hand to try to quickly access that type of information. So like I said, over the next 15 minutes or so, we're going to quickly highlight some of the key areas that are helpful specific to herbicides. We're not necessarily going to highlight the stuff related to insecticides or fungicides today. It'll mainly be focused on herbicides. So to start off with, you can see over on the left here, we've got kind of the table of contents. If we scroll to this crops one page, you can see the key ones here: corn, soybeans, small grains. It's hot linked, so when you click on corn, it'll take you to that first part of the corn section. And so this first part here, pages 1 through 9, are herbicide performance ratings related to different timings for corn herbicides. So you can see they're all in alphabetical order here. Ratings are given on a like a 1 to 10 scale for control of grasses, as well as a lot of the common broadleaves. You can see it also gives us the different sites of action of a herbicide. So Acuron, for example, consists of a group 5, a group 15, and a group 27 component in that premix. Okay, so that's a useful section. Just if you get questions on, hey, how is this product going to do on a specific weed, this is a good resource to flip to and see what the ratings are, or how performance is on a specific weed. Okay, so that's the first section here. Next one we'll kind of scroll to. Next question, a a very common question that we get is, hey, what should the adjuvant pairing be for a specific herbicide? And so the next section after that in corn is adjuvant recommendations. And so you can see here, as you look down, you can see the different recommendations across the top here. Okay, I guess, Tyler, can you still see my screen?
No, I got something else.
Okay, here, let me share my screen. Okay, how about now?
Yep.
Okay, good to go again. Okay, so with this one here, adjuvant recommendations across the top, it has recommendations for surfactants, so NIS, methylated seed oils, high surfactant methylated seed oils, crop oils, as well as high surfactant crop oils. On the adjacent page, you know, if we need to include extra nitrogen in there, it's got a recommendation for that, and then additional AMS as well. And then with Winfield United, our water conditioner is Class Act NG. We also have Class Act, there's some other Class Act products, but NG is the most commonly used one here in our part of the US. So this gives us an indication of if it's approved for a particular product and can be used as the water conditioner. Okay, so pretty good reference, gives you rates for what those adjuvants should be as you take a look at that. Okay, we'll scroll down here. Next section, it kind of splits it out for individual weeds and herbicides across the top. It starts with broadleaves, and then it eventually goes to ratings on grasses. Not necessarily ratings, but it gives us an indication for a specific herbicide, what rate we should be applying, as well as the maximum weed height that it's labeled for control of a specific weed. Okay, so that's the next section. So post-application rates for both broadleaves and grasses. Okay, next one that we'll highlight, there's different restrictions, timings and restrictions. That's the next section that you'll see here. And with that, it gives us an indication for a specific herbicide. You know, what is it labeled for on corn? Is it labeled for all different types of corn or just field corn? And so that tells you the differences up here at the top. It tells you the application timing. You know, is it just as a pre-application? Can we use it post? And what the cutoffs are for that. Also tells us some indication of tillage, if we need to till, or the restrictions around tillage compared to when we're going to be applying that herbicide, and then feeding restrictions. Okay. Next section, scroll down here a little bit. We kind of move into burn down, and it's all in sequential order for the season. Okay, so we have burn down options, what the herbicides are, if there's any kind of soil differences, if we're going to change up the rate based on our soil texture, and then some key watch outs from the label are included in the comments section. And so this is for burn down application in corn. After that, you'll see we've moved into pre-plant herbicide options. There is a section here on growth staging. If you need a quick refresher on how to correctly stage a corn plant through the leaf stages as well as the reproductive stages over here. And then it moves into timing. And so these are our pre-applications where, you know, it's color coded, and it kind of tells us if a specific herbicide is it approved for a pre-application. That's this last column here on the left page. Can we use it pre-plant surface, or do we need to incorporate it? That's the differences in shading here. And then how much before planting can we apply that herbicide? That's the days before planting interval up here. Next one talks about post-application timing. It's color-coded as well. And it's based on the V stages as well as the, we eventually get to tassel time here. And it gives us an indication of if we can do a broadcast application over the top, or eventually with a lot of these, you'll see the darker shading. That tells us that we need to be using drop nozzles, okay? So that's pretty useful because a lot of times we get to that middle part or the latter V stages, and we might get questions around, I've got a specific weed out here. What are my options? And so you can flip to this section of the crop protection guide, and well, you do have a few options here in the later V stages, but you might have to use drop nozzles if that's an option for you. Okay. Let's see. One other section to highlight here. So post herbicides in corn. And similar to that pre and the burn down sections, it tells you the herbicides, if there's rate differences based on your soil texture, and then some key information from the label. Okay, and that's really kind of how it's set up for the herbicide portion for corn. If we scroll down to the herbicide section for beans, set up exactly the same as far as the flow of the information. I think for sake of time, we will probably not go through all the different sections for soybean, but just know that it is set up exactly the same. It starts with burn down, you have your ratings, and then you have your pre-herbicides, your initial ratings on broadleaves and grasses, and then your post-herbicides as well. Okay. Does give you the adjuvant recommendation similar to that corn section. It's pretty useful to have that as well. So I think we will go ahead and skip down to some of the technical information. One thing I will highlight here, there are some other sections. I know in the Midwest, we're mainly focused on corn and beans. But a lot of times we'll get questions around alfalfa. We might get questions around pastures. And so in the crops 2 section, there's a section on alfalfa, a section on pastures, as well as these other crops. Sorghum, we might get some questions, or millet. We might get questions around millet as well. So there's a section for those crops in the guide. Vegetable crops. Every once in a while, we get an off-the-wall question, pumpkins. I've gotten questions around pumpkins. So there is a section that does cover pumpkins here in the vegetable and citrus part. Set up similar, although it's going to be much narrower. There's not going to be nearly as much information just because there's not as many herbicides, not as many pesticides that are specifically focused on pumpkins compared to corn and soybeans. And then another section is non-crop. We'll get questions around ponds. What can I apply to ponds? So we have an aquatic section here. Brush and woody plants, CRP. A lot of these are we do get frequent questions around each of these types of scenarios. What can we apply in those settings to control, like in CRP, what can we apply to control different trees if we have some trees coming up? And so we'd look at the CRP section to kind of get us in the ballpark, get us an idea of what we can apply in those situations. Okay. The last section I wanted to highlight here around herbicides is the technical information section. So I'd say next to the initial corn and soybean section, this is the most frequent section that I turn to, where it does go through a lot of very good information. So the first one here, we'll go to site of action. And I'd mentioned this before, over the next 2 weeks, we're going to, or next week and the following week at least, we're going to touch on a lot more in depth the specific site of action that are commonly used in production ag. And so this listed out here, what's the mode of action, or what's the general effect on the plant, what's the specific site of action, or what exact enzyme or process is being shut down within that plant to kill the weed. And then it also lists out specific trade names of products, okay, that fall under this specific site of action. If you need a refresher on, hey, what's some of the general symptomology that these different herbicides create within broadleaves and grass plants, they've got pictures here at the back of that section. So here we've got our meristematic inhibitors, so shoot inhibitors, root inhibitors, your group 3s and your group 15 products. Got some other ones here, ALS inhibitors, looks like. But this is a good refresher on, hey, what's symptomology look like that you might be running into out in the field. Next one here, Tyler's going to go into this section here in just a couple minutes, a lot more in depth. What are the different herbicide properties and how do they impact movement and retention and breakdown of those herbicides in the soil? And so this kind of walks us through soil absorption, half-life, water solubility, some of the key properties that affect those herbicides. Okay. Next one that we'll touch on here, herbicide classification, page 742 in the current guide. A lot of times we'll get questions around tank mixing. Hey, when should I add this product to the tank, or what is the formulation? And that's how you can use this specific section. If you come to this section here, the formulation is in that second column, atrazine 4L. The L gives you an indication it's a liquid. Some of these other ones in here, Bicep, for example, over on the second page, it's an SC, so a suspension concentrate. And then we've got other ones that are ECs, emulsifiable concentrates. This does give us an indication of what the exact formulation is, so we can kind of have a general idea of where it should be placed in that tank mix order. Okay. Get down. Just a couple other quick things to highlight. Premixed conversions. There's a section for herbicides as well as other pesticides in here. A lot of times you might get asked, hey, for a specific product, what's the split, or how many ounces of each component am I getting when I make the application? And so here, for example, dimetric charged, it's a combination of that metribuzin or dimetric component, as well as the flumioxazin or Valor. And so we can look at the overall rate for dimetric charge and kind of break it out for the Valor. How much Valor are we getting out of that? And then how much metribuzin or dimetric is coming with that rate as well. Okay. Winter storage temperatures. We sent this out here in the last couple of weeks. You might have the question, how do I need to put this in heated storage over the winter, or can I let it freeze and then we thaw it out in the spring? And so this lets you know, based on the specific crop protection product, what the minimum rate should be for it. The NSP, it's basically no specific protocol for that. Is what that means. But in general, it lets you know the minimum storage temperature. Okay. Go down to 794. Minimum rain-free interval. If a storm's coming, how long do I need to give it after the application before rain comes? And is the application going to still be okay? And so this lets you know, Fusillade, for example, I need to give it an hour. There needs to be an hour of rain-free after it's been applied. Okay. Rotation restrictions. This comes up frequently. I've applied this product, or maybe there's been a mix-up of I applied a specific corn herbicide on a soybean acre, and what can I plant now? And so this would give you an idea, you know, if I've applied a specific product, what the minimum interval is before I can come in and plant these specific crops, okay? And then the last one that I'll mention is right here. So residue testing, that's become a bigger issue or a bigger question. You know, can I send tissue in and have it tested to see what herbicide's been applied? So the answer to that is yes. There's different labs. South Dakota Ag Lab is one that you can send residue samples in, so tissue tests, and they can test it for specific herbicides. It's not cheap. It's kind of an expensive test, but it does. They are able to narrow down specific herbicides that might have been applied, or the herbicides that's showing up on that tissue sample. Okay. So those are some of the key things. That's kind of a whirlwind tour of just the herbicide portions, but really wanted to highlight some of those crops portions at the top, as well as the technical information section. And so I will say, if you don't have a copy of the crop protection guide, please visit with your Winfield United rep, either get a hard copy or a digital copy. It's a very useful tool to have on hand. So
Hey, Darren.
I think at this time we'll flip. Yeah. Tyler.
On this page right here, one thing to highlight, we've had a fairly dry year, and I know that people often forget on the atrazine side of things, we have a restriction of 2 cropping seasons to alfalfa. And so this does lay out, there is a soil test that you can have to determine whether or not you can plant alfalfa in the spring or not. And so that's right there, almost, yep, right there. So, all right.
All right.
All right, so the rest of the time we're going to spend looking at some of the herbicide basics for kind of preparing us for herbicide modes of action, okay? And so with this, we're going to start in talking about some of the herbicide basics, okay? One of the most basic concepts we have to understand is that over time we can develop resistance to weeds and or to herbicides. And there are quite a few different ways that this manifests itself, okay? This is a good example of how herbicide resistance forms, okay? So here we have atrazine, which is group 5, Cobra, which is group 14, and Raptor, which is group 2, all of which should kill this water hemp. But you'll notice that 10 days after the treatment, that the resistant weed on the end hasn't even been phased by the chemistry. In fact, all 3 of those modes of action had no efficacy on that weed whatsoever. Okay, and that's the problem with herbicide resistance, as there's not a lot of new modes of action coming to market. And so we have to do a better job of identifying and trying to eliminate as much weed resistance as we possibly can. Because after all, since we've brought any one of these chemistries out, guys, there is resistance to every single one of these different modes of action, okay, including the synthetic auxins. So as well as XtendiMax and Genia and List are still doing today, we do expect some resistance to build up. In fact, I've been walking some complaints that may have signs of showing some resistance already to dicamba. Okay, and that's a bad day, because after we lose those modes of action, what real options do we have? We don't have a lot of any. And when you look at it, this is what we'll end up with, right? Just a mess out in that field. Okay, so we have to do a good job of managing these chemistries to make sure that we don't build up weed resistance out in the field. In fact, I think, Darren, you always show a slide at your presentations there that shows that if you really want to fight weed resistance, you need to have at least 3 effective modes of action per year to eliminate as much chance of seeing weed resistance as we possibly can. Okay, if you think about it, weed resistance, basically how it forms is that you're using the same mode of action over and over again. Okay, and if I put on my farmer hat, you have a chemistry that works really, really well. What are you going to do? Well, we're going to use it again and again and again. Okay, and that's part of the problem that we run into, is that we build resistance so quickly because we're using that same mode of action over and over again. Okay, so what ends up happening then is we build up resistance to that. And of course, you know, the farmer wants to try it one more year because he wants to make sure it doesn't work, right? Okay, we need to have at least 3 effective modes of action to control as many of these weeds as we possibly can. Okay, another thing on the weed resistance part that I'm going to spend a little time on is one-pass programs. It's one of the quickest ways to get herbicide resistance is to rely on one-pass systems. Okay, and the reason why, although a lot of those one-pass systems do have quite a few effective modes of action, the problem is if one weed escapes that, you don't have that second pass that'll come back in and kill that weed that escaped. Okay, so the multiple pass, that 2-pass program is going to be a lot more effective at controlling weeds as compared to the 1-pass system. Okay, and you always have risks with the 1-pass system as well. If you don't get good control the first time, that's when we really start to struggle. And one of the biggest things you have to realize is once we lose that control the first time, you've already seen a yield loss. Okay, so even if you have the program backed up by a respray program, you're already losing that yield. Okay, so you're often better off spraying a pre up front and then coming back in with that post to try to control those weeds. Okay, if you really want to know what you have out in your farm too, this is, I love this picture. You can see we have a lot of giant ragweed just starting to germinate on the back of the combine here. So definitely want to be watching this so that we don't have weed resistance issues. And this is actually already getting a little bit old and a little bit dated, but Iowa State did a study that looked at the percentage of water hemp populations showing resistance to certain modes of action. Okay, and you can see that a majority of these, we used to rely a lot on Pursuit. Okay, Pursuit was very effective when it first came out, and it was very good at controlling weeds in soybeans. The problem is that it was so widely used, and unfortunately, the site of action was so easily altered that about 95% of the water hemp populations that were screened showed resistance to a 1x rate of the chemistry. And by the way, even at a 4x rate, we still didn't get much better control. Okay, now you can see the photosystem 2, atrazine, we got some resistance. We got some resistance to glyphosate, Callisto, and I'm guessing this Cobra, these PPO inhibitors is much higher today than what it was back when they did this study. Okay, because once glyphosate started failing, we did go back to these PPO inhibitors, and those started to fail as well. And so we do have a lot of resistance showing up. Now, what's interesting is looking at this chart and understanding how weed resistance forms. Okay, there's a couple different methods. Okay, first one, if you look at like ALS, so with Pursuit, With Pursuit, what happened is there was actually a change in the site of action. Okay, so that the Pursuit molecule no longer binds to where it needs to bind to control that weed. Okay, and so with that, we wouldn't expect an increase in rate to have much better control. And you can see there isn't a whole lot of difference between a 1x rate and a 4x rate. Okay, there's another way to develop weed resistance, and it's down here. And that's by actually multiplying the amount of the EPSP enzyme, for example, with glyphosate. So glyphosate, when we go into mode of action, it actually shuts down the EPSP enzyme. Okay, and I am not going to attempt to describe or actually say what this is, but the EPSP enzyme is really important in developing different enzymes and proteins in that plant. Okay, now what's interesting is when you look at the weed resistance to glyphosate, the way that the weeds are getting around it is they're actually producing a 10x rate, for example, of that EPSP enzyme. So what they're doing is they're actually just producing more of that enzyme. Okay, now we expect then with a higher rate of glyphosate, then we would expect to see a little bit better control, and we do. And the reason why is because now, even though that weed, that resistant weed, is producing more of that EPSP enzyme, if we up the rate of glyphosate, we still get control of even some of those resistant weeds. Again, I don't know if I'd call them resistance, but more tolerance in this case. Now, the interesting part about this as well is that in some cases, they found that earlier applications, when that weed is really, really small, that weed may not have had enough time to develop enough of this EPSP enzyme. So we were able to get control of certain weeds, for example, water hemp, by spraying it when it was 2 inches versus once it got to 6 inches, we didn't get very good control. Okay, and all has to do with how much of this enzyme is actually being produced. Okay, we are starting to see some resistance to the HPPD inhibitors. Okay, and that does worry me because in the past, we haven't necessarily had to worry as much about corn in the past because these HPPD inhibitors were very, very good at controlling weeds. Okay, but now that we're starting to see some resistance to that, I am starting to get concerned about some of the activity that we have on some of our weed spectrum, especially some of the HPPD inhibitors on something like a giant ragweed. And we are seeing some resistance to water hemp as well. But some of the giant ragweed, some of these HPPD inhibitors weren't that strong on it to begin with. And now we're really starting to see some of the resistance issues that were popping up for these HPPD inhibitors. And that study that I was talking about earlier, what it shows is that the more modes of action that you put into that system, the less likely you're going to see resistance build up to those modes of action. Okay, so think of it this way. If you had a water hemp plant and there's a water hemp bank of seed there, and 0.00001% of the population is naturally resistant to glyphosate. Okay, over time, the more that I use glyphosate, the quicker the more prevalent that water hemp plant is going to be that is resistant to the glyphosate, right? And there's always seems to be a little bit of natural tolerance to any one of our herbicides. So we're selecting for those herbicide resistant weeds. Okay, now if you think about it, if we go back to when glyphosate was very, very effective, and if we were to mix that with a different type of chemistry, for example, let's say 2,4-D, what do you guys think the chance of that 0.00001% of the population of water hemp that was resistant to glyphosate also being resistant to 2,4-D? Well, the answer is it's very, very, very low, right? So the more modes of action that we can put out there, and by the way, it's effective modes of action. Okay, and that's part of the problem. If we've already lost control and we've already have resistance built up, so for example, if glyphosate is not killing the water hemp anymore, we can't count that as an effective mode of action. So in some of our fields, unfortunately, we've limited ourselves significantly by developing resistance to the various chemistries that we're putting out there. Okay, but what this indicates is that if you're using 3 effective modes of action, the probability of seeing resistance goes down significantly. All right, so herbicide mode of action. So when you think about it, the mode of action, and we often use these two simultaneously, but they are different, okay? The mode of action is the entire process or the mechanism by which the herbicide kills the plants. It's basically the sequence of events from absorption through plant death. Okay, whereas the site of action, which is actually what we're demonstrating with the group numbers, the site of action refers to the precise plant function that is disrupted by the herbicide in the plant. Okay, so if you think about it, a good example of the mode of action, okay, technically ALS inhibitors and glyphosate, so the EPSP inhibitors, have the same mode of action. Okay, they go through the plant very similarly. They both interrupt an enzyme. The difference is they have different sites of action. Okay, glyphosate interrupts the EPSP enzyme synthesis, whereas the ALS interrupts the ALS enzyme synthesis. Okay, so the site of action is actually the group numbers that we're thinking about. Okay, we often use these two interchangeably, but just so you know, they are slightly different. Okay, now in order to effectively control a weed, okay, the first thing we have to do is we have to adequately contact the weed. Okay, that makes sense, right? So anything that we can do to get better coverage on the plant, keep that droplet wetter longer is going to be key. Because guys, once the herbicide dries on the leaf surface, we're done with herbicide absorption. There's very little herbicide that gets absorbed after the droplet dries on the leaf. Okay, so this is where a lot of our adjuvants come into play. If we can keep that droplet wetter longer on the leaf surface, we can get more activity. Okay, also the better coverage that we can get and the more spread out on that leaf surface we can get, the better overall our herbicide activity is going to be. Okay, the next step, the herbicide must be absorbed in sufficient quantities to move within the plant. Then we have to move within the weed to the site of action without being deactivated. Okay, now some of our herbicides, and we'll go through this, but there are certain herbicides that the site of action is the leaf itself. Okay, so if you think of like Cobra, Flexstar, Liberty, those contact type chemistries, wherever that hits on the leaf, that is the site of action. So we don't have to move that herbicide. So one study that was interesting Liberty can be translocated very effectively within the plant. Okay, if Liberty is sprayed at night, Liberty will move through the plant, and actually a lot of it will end up in the roots. Okay, the problem is in that case, we're actually moving it away from the site of action. Okay, and so it's important to understand how the herbicide moves in the plant. We had actually a question, I saw you guys on the chat feature there, about spraying a pasture here in the fall. Okay, well, why would I spray a weed in the fall versus a weed in the spring? Well, a lot of it has to do with the movement of the herbicide in the plant. Okay, so if you think of something like a 2,4-D or dicamba, which is usually what we're going to use to spray pastures, okay, they have to move within the plant. They are what we call systemic. So they're going to move throughout the entire plant. Okay, well, if you think about fall applications, especially for perennial weeds or biennial weeds, so think of things like mare's tail or things like thistles. A lot of people are spraying thistles in pastures. Canada thistle, bull thistle, musk thistle, any one of those. Okay. A lot of our herbicides, 2,4-D, dicamba, glyphosate, those type of chemistries actually move in the sugars of the plant. The reason that's important is that if you think about where the sugars are moving this time of year, they're moving down into the root to get to try to store up for the winter. And that's the reason why herbicides being sprayed at this time of year are very effective, because of the fact that your sugars are moving down to be stored in the roots. And that's actually where we get a lot of efficacy of those herbicides, if they're moving down through the growing point into the roots. Okay, so my answer would be, if you have somebody that's still looking to a fall burn down, as long as the frost, and I know we've had a light frost, but guys, I look at the dandelions out in my yard, you could still get effective control of dandelions right now. Okay, because the leaves aren't crispy and dead. Okay, so as long as you still have green tissue to spray, I would say go out and make the herbicide application yet this fall. Because come spring, when the herbicide or when the sugars start going up from the root, what ends up happening when we make an application at that time, the herbicide follows the sugars, heads up in the plant. What we often end up doing is we kill the top of the plant off, and out from the base comes new growth, and we basically start all over again. Okay, so it's really, really important to understand how our herbicide moves within the plant. The final step, we must reach toxic levels at the site of action to get decent control. Okay, now there's a couple different ways herbicides move within the plant. So translocation, does the herbicide move to the sensitive parts of that plant? Herbicides are either a contact type chemistry, or they're a what we call systemic. Now, there's two varying types of systemic chemistries. There's one that can move through the xylem, and others that can move through the phloem. And then there's actually still others that move through both. Okay, so when you think of xylem and phloem, so xylem is a continuous system of non-living cells and intercellular space. Okay, this is what's moving all of your water and nutrients up through the roots to the top of the plant. Okay, it's a major pathway for that movement. Phloem is the continuous system of living cells. It's where we are moving all of our sugars and all of our, well, basically sugars or anything that you're moving that's required for growth. Okay, so with the phloem, it's going to move following a sink source relationship. So xylem pretty much when you think of xylem, it's going to move from the bottom of the plant up to where the most water is being utilized in the plant. Okay, so if you think of herbicides that are being moved primarily through the xylem, think of things like atrazine. Okay, atrazine moves primarily through the xylem. And so when you see that, what you'll see is it will move up and out. So if I am looking for damage from atrazine, I'm going to look at the old growth first. Okay, because it's always going to move up into the plant and towards the most or the highest water demand within that plant, which is actually often the old growth. Okay, so great example is I went out on a complaint call. Boy, this is probably 4 or 5 years ago. We were looking at it, got out into the field, and all of the lower leaves of the soybean, and it was soybeans that we were looking at, all the lower leaves were burned off. Okay, and then the leaves above it, you could see a burning type edge to the outside leaves, because xylem was going to move up and it's going to move out to the outside edge of the leaf. And so it was characteristic sign of atrazine when I started looking at it. So then we started asking them questions, and, you know, did you have atrazine out in the field last year? He said, yeah, I did, but it was only like a half a pound. Okay, when was the application made? Well, the application was made the end of May. Okay, well, that shouldn't carry over. And so we ended up going back to this guy's farmstead and started looking at his chemical mixing area. Okay, and he was actually using dry atrazine, and it turns out his dry atrazine was right next to his bags of dry AMS. So I think what happened in that field is he accidentally threw a bag of atrazine in there rather than AMS. Okay, but that's a characteristic sign of a xylem mobile herbicide like atrazine, is it moves up and out, and it's going to move into that old growth first. Okay, with phloem, it's going to move wherever the plant is actively using sugars. Okay, so some of it's going to move to the roots, others of it is going to move to the new growth. Okay, so think of things like 2,4-D, dicamba, glyphosate. Actually, most of our HPPD inhibitors are in this classification as well. Where we'd expect to see the most damage in this case is in the new growth. Okay, because that's where the sugars are going. Okay, now when you look at contact versus systemic, and the only reason I show this slide is because it took me a long time to make, but a contact type herbicide, wherever that droplet hits on the leaf, that's where we're going to get control. Okay, so it's going to be really important that we get good coverage here. Whereas systemic is going to move throughout that entire plant and get us control by movement. And usually it's going to follow the sugars of the plant. Okay, so with contact type chemistry, coverage is extremely important. We need higher carrier volumes and smaller droplet sizes. Whereas systemic coverage, not as important. We can use a little bit lower carrier volumes and larger droplet sizes. All right, activities of herbicides. Now, when you look at an activity of herbicides, a lot of it's going to depend on the water solubility, the soil absorption and retention, and the persistence or half-life. Okay, understand that not one single part of this, so water solubility, soil absorption, or persistence, will determine how active a herbicide is. Okay, it's a combination of these three that determines the overall ability of that herbicide to kill a weed. Okay, so let's start with water solubility. Okay, it's a measure of how easily the pesticide is washed off the crop, leached in the soil, or the movement of that herbicide in the plant, or sorry, in the soil. Okay, it's measured in parts per million. Pesticides with a water solubility of greater than 1 part per million, or sorry, less than 1 part per million, tend not to leach, but may move with the soil sediment or surface runoff. Whereas if we have a water solubility greater than 30 parts per million, it's more likely to move. Okay, so think of something like atrazine, for example, and you guys will know these chemistries as well, because most of them on their label will indicate that you can't be within 50 feet of a well or an intake or something like that. Okay. Now, water solubility makes a difference in another way as well. Okay. And it has to do with the activity of the herbicide. Okay. So if you think of a herbicide that is fairly water soluble, in a dry year, that herbicide will probably outperform a herbicide that's not very water soluble. Okay, because if you think about it, the way that these herbicides are taken into the plant is they have to be solubilized in water. Okay, and especially when you start thinking of our group 15 type herbicides, we really start to see the activity of those depending on the water solubility. Okay, so if you take, like, for example, dimethylamide P, which is the Outlook. Okay, Outlook is very water soluble. Okay, so in a dry year, we do expect to see Outlook perform very well in getting decent weed control. However, in a wet year, with how water soluble it is, it will tend to move, and so we won't get as effective control in a wet year. Okay, the exact opposite side of the spectrum happens with Zidua. Okay, Zidua is not very water soluble at all. So in a dry year, we might not get enough rain to get that activated. It takes roughly about an inch of rain to get Zidua activated. However, in a wet year, we do tend to have better control with Zidua because of the fact that it's not very water soluble. And so we do get longer lasting control out of that. Okay, now it's not a perfect science, because if you take actually S-metallochlor, so dual is fairly water soluble. However, we need at least an inch of rain to get enough of that activated to get decent control. Okay, and the reason has to do with the amount of that herbicide that needs to be active to get control. Okay, and a lot of that with dual too has to deal with the soil's absorption factor. Okay, it's a measure in the tendency of the pesticide to be attached to soil colloids. Okay, so it's measured in KOC. Very strong attachment soil colloids are less likely to move unless soil erosion occurs, whereas pesticides 300 to 500 KOC tend to move with water and have the potential to leach or move with surface runoff. Guys, in general too, the more tightly that a herbicide is held to the soil surface, the less activity that you have of that herbicide, and probably the less long-lasting effect. Okay, if you think of something like a glyphosate, for example, glyphosate has a very high KOC. That's why we don't get any soil activity out of glyphosate, is because it's so tightly bound with the soil colloid. And so because of that, we don't get very effective soil residual activity out of glyphosate because of the fact that it's so tightly held. Okay, and then finally, we have our persistence or half-life. This is measured in the time of days for the pesticide to degrade in the soil. Okay, so pesticides with a half-life of greater than 21 days have the greater potential to persist long enough to leach or move with the surface runoff. Okay, so persistence. Now, in general, guys, the longer that it lasts, the longer that half-life is, the the longer the herbicide will be active as well. Okay. Remember, it's a combination of these three things: the absorption, the water solubility, and the persistence that determines how active that particular herbicide is going to be in the soil. Now, as far as risk for the groundwater contamination, you guys can go through and look at each one of these categories and determine which one would indicate a higher risk to groundwater contamination. Okay, but I'm going to skip and go to this slide here because I think this one's interesting. Remember, it's a combination of all of these. Okay, so when you take a look at atrazine, for example, atrazine is fairly, actually atrazine is not as water soluble as what you would think. However, because it's not very tightly held to the soil particle and it has a long half-life, we do get some leaching of atrazine. Okay, dual, you can see here that even though we have a 530 part per million water solubility, it's very tightly held to that soil particle. And so it does take a little bit more rain to get that one activated. Okay, so it's a combination of all of these factors that determine how much activity you're going to get out of it. Outlook, for example, water solubility is very, very high. The soil absorption index is low. So this one is not going to last as long as, for example, Zidua, which has a very low water solubility and a very high, or sorry, about the same soil absorption index here. So with that, that pretty much covers everything that we wanted to get covered here today. Next week, we're going to start in, and I'm actually going to be gone. So Darren's going to start in on herbicide groups. So he's going to go through herbicide groups 1 through 5. And then when I get back, I'm going to cover the rest of the herbicides on the next week. Okay, so we'll stop the recording here and we will